and good morning. It's really a treat, and I want to just encourage everyone to come forward so you can all be seen, because this is an incredible group of people that I'm particularly proud to stand here with this morning, folks who are practitioners, thinkers, leaders in our education arena here in Massachusetts. And together it has been our assignment for the last year to address the biggest, most important question in education policy in Massachusetts today. And that is, 22 years into education reform, how do we protect the strides that we've made, and how do we do better in the places where we failed? Now, anyone who follows education politics in our state will know that it is not that common to see all of these people here holding hands on the same side of an issue. We have superintendents, school committee members, teachers, state regulators, business community leaders, legislators, Democrats, Republicans. In recent years, we have all seen or experienced an increasing level of warning signs about our schools, accumulating budget cuts year after year, a fraying of the system that has brought us so far since 1993, stagnant achievement gaps, growing social inequality. Until now, there has been a vague agreement that there is a problem, but not about the scope of it or about what to do about it. Today, that is different. Today, that changes. Today, we have a shared analysis of what the problem is, and we're presenting the legislature with a roadmap of what to do about it. And our message to our colleagues in the building, and indeed to every Bay Stater, is let's not wait until our schools are chronically underperforming or our state is chronically underperforming in order to take action. What I'd like to do is introduce my co-chair of the commission, Alice Peisch, Representative Alice Peisch. She is going to walk you through the first few recommendations of the report. I'll come back then and walk you through the next few recommendations in the report, and then you're going to hear from a few of the other stakeholders here this morning.
Now, the first two recommendations that I'd like to speak to, the Commission actually came to agreement on last spring. As many of the people in this room are aware, for many years we really have been aware of the fact that the amounts in the foundation budget relative to employee health benefits are much lower than what the actual costs have been to districts over the years, and also that special education costs have been outstripping what the foundation budget has assumed, both for in-district and out-of-district to varying degrees. So the recommendations of the Commission with respect to those items, which I think are of tremendous significance, recommend that the health insurance component be adjusted to reflect what the GIC's average cost is. And I think we chose the GIC because that is considered to be to provide both comprehensive coverage at a reasonable cost. And one of the charges of this commission was to look at not only what are people actually spending, but how can we ensure that our dollars are being spent in effective and efficient ways. So pegging the insurance cost to the GIC, we believe, achieves that goal. In addition, we recommend that there be a separate inflationary index for health insurance, as the index in the foundation formula that covers other costs did not reflect over the course of the past 20-some-odd years, the rate at which health insurance, unfortunately, actually grew. And finally, with respect to health insurance, we're recommending that the formula capture the cost of the retiree component of health insurance, because regardless of who's actually bearing that cost, either the district or the municipality must cover the retiree health insurance costs for former school employees. With respect to special education, we are recommending that the assumed percent of in-district special education students be raised slightly to reflect that we are actually serving more students with slightly higher intensities than the foundation formula currently acknowledges. And with respect to the out-of-district placements, we did find that the assumption of the 1% enrollment was relatively close to what we see, but there's a gap in what the foundation provides for out-of-district tuition before the circuit breaker reimbursement kicks in. So we would recommend closing that gap. I think this is these recommendations taken together, if ultimately adopted, will really have a tremendous impact on those districts that are currently spending at the foundation level. They have no discretion with respect to spending on employee health insurance and special education. So as a result, money is being taken away from other areas that the foundation budget provides for in order to fund these components. With sufficient funding for these areas, millions of dollars across the Commonwealth will be freed up to spend on the kinds of things that we know students need. And not surprisingly, the districts that typically spend their foundation are those that have less resources. The more well-resourced communities spend above foundation, so while it's been a strain for those communities, it is not as, I believe this will have the most impact on communities that currently spend at foundation. So I look forward to continuing to work on these recommendations in the legislature, and I will now turn it back to my co-chair to discuss the other recommendations. Thank you.
Before I forget, I'd also be remiss. You see, behind us here, several legislators who were themselves members of the commission. I also want to give a shout out to Senator Jason Lewis, who's joining us this morning as a cheerleader and a longtime champion of the work of the Foundation Budget Review Commission, and who helped us get this commission established in law in the first place. The recommendations that you just heard Representative Peisch outline are things that I think fall under the bucket, generally speaking, of things that we need to do to the foundation budget to keep it strong and functional in areas where it has been strong in the past couple decades since its original inception. There was another bucket of work, if you will, that the commission undertook, and that was to address the fact that in the 22 years since education reform was passed, while we have succeeded in getting many of our students to the goal line, many students we have not succeeded in getting to that goal line. And when we say that we mean to provide quality education to all students in Massachusetts, we mean all. And many children, unfortunately, are still waiting for that promise to be fulfilled, namely poor kids, so many of whom are Black and Latino, and also English language learners. And so this was the next challenge on the Commission's docket, how to succeed in areas where the foundation budget has failed thus far. So the Commission came up with several recommendations on that front. First, we recommend increasing the additional weighting or the additional cost increment put into the formula for English language learner students. And what we found in looking at practices across the country is that, in particular for high school years, that Massachusetts was out of step with the national range of what it costs to adequately educate English language learners. And so we're proposing bringing that increment up to its current high water mark in Massachusetts, which is at the middle school level, in particular to provide more resources in the other grades, especially at the high school level. We also recommend increasing the weighting for low-income students in districts that have high concentrations of poverty. And we propose to do this through a tiered system, although we leave flexibility in our recommendations to the legislature on precisely how to structure those tiers. But the report gives guidance to the legislature that that additional increment should fall somewhere within the range of 50 to 100% of the baseline cost per pupil. And also the guidance that the additional increment should be enough to ensure that districts can undertake multiple interventions, multiple strategies at the same time in order to help low-income students in those high-poverty districts, again, get to that goal line. The next recommendation is a segue back to the efficient and effective resource allocation charge that Representative Peisch mentioned earlier. And that is that the legislature should consider a funding vehicle, whether it's through Chapter 70 or another vehicle, for the wider provision of high-quality early education. And this intersects both with issues of closing the achievement gap and with issues of special education, because data are quite conclusive that there are few tools more powerful than high-quality early education for both closing the achievement gap and for saving the state and localities dollars on special education. Also, under the banner of efficient and effective resource allocation, the Commission recommends that we establish a system for data tracking of expenditures on ELL, and I should qualify my jargon there, English language learners is ELL, for ELL students and low-income students, which is a current bald spot in our tracking abilities as a state. And also that we beef up our ability to track spending in all categories down to the school level, so that in the future, for policy making or practice decisions, whether it's at the state level, district level, or at the school level, that we have more information about what's working and what's working efficiently in order to get kids to that goal line. And then finally, we recommend the establishment of an ongoing stakeholder data advisory committee in recognition of the very complicated and multi-layered work of setting up and using all of those data systems. So that's a speed tour through the recommendations. And now to give some historical context and some mission context, we wanted to ask to come forward one of the original architects of the 1993 Ed Reform Act, our recent former education secretary here in Massachusetts, and now a professor at Harvard Graduate School of Education, Professor Paul Russell.
So I'm happy to be able to say that roughly 25 years ago, a number of us from the business community, from the two branches of the legislature, from the executive branch, came together to put a stake in the ground and put a flag in the ground that stood for both excellence and equity in terms of education in Massachusetts. There were a lot of deep, persistent problems that we surveyed at the time, not least of which were school finance problems that had some of our districts running student-teacher ratios of 1 to 55. And the state racing in to give emergency aid under those circumstances. But most importantly, in the Education Reform Act of 1993, we instantiated in state law an expectation that we would educate all of our students to a high level, and all means all. And we put together, unlike many other states who simply declared that as a goal and didn't do anything about it, this legislature, this executive branch, it was in place at the time and many to follow it, put in place actual funding increases, dramatic funding increases, increased the level of state funding for public education in Massachusetts, doubled that funding over a 7-year period, and put in place a complex formula, which we're discussing today, to achieve 3 goals: adequacy, equity, and stability in school finance. And we did such a good job in that regard that by early 2001, we had in Massachusetts the only what was called negative equity gap in the country, where we were spending more in our 25% poorest communities than we were spending in our 25% most affluent communities. So we went out on a limb. Beacon Hill went out on a limb to provide educators the wherewithal to achieve the audacious goal of educating all students to a high level. And we can be really proud of that as a Commonwealth. What we did in describing that formula at the time was actually incorporate a spreadsheet into legislation. And the legislature was understandably reluctant over the years to reopen the whole discussion about what went into the spreadsheet. So there were only modest efforts at tinkering with the basic assumptions that went into calculating what would constitute adequacy, what would we need to provide. Bear in mind, this formula was developed before we had standards. Before we had some of the nation's highest standards, we had high stakes. We agreed to hold people accountable for performance and measure performance. But before all that happened, we made an estimate of what would constitute adequacy. And it was built into hundreds of different assumptions about what district expenditures would be. And for the most part, those proved fair guidance as districts went forward and reasonably accurate. But what you're seeing today is now the legislature has had the courage to go back in and have a look, and where this formula is radically out of whack, for example, in the healthcare insurance, or in our assumptions about educating students with disabilities, to reestablish the bar on what constitutes adequacy, and to sort of insist and advocate for the necessary resources to get to that level, so that districts are given the support that they need to achieve the ambitious goal that Beacon Hill has set for people, which we have not yet attained. As the chair pointed out, we set out for all means all. We still have an iron law correlation in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts between socioeconomic status and educational attainment and achievement. This is what we set out to eliminate. We used phrases like, we're going to eliminate the correlation between your zip code and your educational achievement. But folks, we haven't done that yet. So putting adequate resources in place is an absolutely imperative first step in that direction. And I applaud the legislature and the executive branch for participating in this effort to take a hard analytical look of what it takes to get this job done. This is a job that no other jurisdiction has ever achieved, and yet we have the courage to continue facing it And today's report marks an important step in that direction, so I commend it to your attention.
I'm glad that Secretary Revel gave that background, that sort of historical context, because we were a pioneering state in developing a foundation budget, in allocating local and state shares. And as the Secretary said, this was part of a grand bargain. Investment in return for results, accountability for results. We aimed high as a Commonwealth. We have revisited elements of that formula that were laid out in the '93 law. We upgraded our learning expectations, what we call curriculum frameworks or standards, in 2010. We're now looking at our assessment system, looking at PARCC as a new assessment, looking at what the next generation assessment in Massachusetts should be. And as this commission has been at, we're looking at the foundation budget and the formula in that budget. I'm going to focus particularly on the recommendations around efficient and effective use of resources, because I think this is critical. When we go to the taxpayers and ask them to increase their investment in the Commonwealth's K-12 system, we need to be able to say to them that we're doing the best that we can with the dollars that we have. And it's worth noting that various analyses that look at the linkage between total spending levels and academic results show very little relationship. We can find districts that, and you can pick your measure, we can find districts with equal levels of academic attainment that are spending greatly disparate levels of dollars on their education system. We spend in Massachusetts north of $16 billion a year on the K-12 sector, all revenue sources combined, federal, local, and state revenue. And that doesn't include retiree benefits, building costs are not included in that figure. So I'm interested not simply in asking for more and calling for greater investment, but I'm particularly interested in the recommendations in the report about effective and efficient use of funds. And I thought Chair Chang Diaz did a great job of painting a high-level picture of what that calls for, what the report calls for in that regard, in terms of doing a better job of accounting for the dollars that we use and figuring out what's paying dividends, what's getting us the kind of impact on students' education that we should be investing more in, and what are we spending on that doesn't seem to be showing the kind of payoff that we would hope, and let's back off of that. So I'm very excited about this report and the possibilities going forward for policy and legislation around our funding formula.
Thanks, Commissioner. Next, I want to ask up to the podium Rebecca Cusick, who is a teacher who's joining us this morning from Fall River. Although not a commission member, she's going to have the weighty responsibility of hopefully putting these resources to good use if they are acted upon by the legislature. Come on up. Ms. Cusick not only is a teacher, but notably she is a 22-year veteran of the classroom. And folks, we didn't even plan it, that her first year in the classroom was the year that the original Education Reform Act was first passed. Ms. Cusick, please.
Thank you. In Fall River, we work really hard to make sure that all of our students receive a high-quality education. But the needs of children in gateway communities like mine are significant, and they're getting more significant every day. Many of our students live in economic insecurity, and they deal with the chronic stress that's associated with the stress of poverty. Additional resources would be a huge benefit to us in meeting the needs of our most vulnerable students and allowing them to focus on that education. When thinking about where those resources could go, communities like mine would certainly benefit from smaller class sizes, which would allow for more individual student attention, and the result would be a greater impact on student learning and social emotional growth. No kindergarten class should have 30 students in it, yet in Fall River, that's the norm. We see an increase in the number of students suffering from trauma and emotional disorders. Additional funding will go a long way in helping our families and the students deal with this trauma. Special education and ELL students have unique needs that can't be met in classes of 30 or without the extra resources. Expanding access to high-quality preschool programs would help our children enter school with a strong foundation on which we can build. It would also allow them to develop the social skills that are necessary to be successful in a classroom setting and to be exposed to academic content through developmentally appropriate play. Our students also deserve time for enrichment activities. In Fall River, we see that opportunity in the schools that have expanded day time, but not all schools have that. Adding time to the school day would allow educators more time to collaborate and engage in professional development as well. Basically, school is a place where many of our students are in the safest and most secure setting that they see all day long. And we need to make sure that that environment is as comprehensive and as nurturing as possible for the benefit of all. Thank you.
So I just want to close by offering a quick paraphrase from the report's own closing, and that is this. While none of us here on this commission are unaware of the budget pressures that are constantly weighing on folks in this building, we nonetheless counsel the legislature to act with urgency to take up these recommendations. There is simply nothing that the legislature can do that is more important to the long-term health of the Commonwealth and to our Constitution's charge and mandate that we cherish public education.